And then I saw her. Not my sister, not my mother, something else. Something wearing their faces, standing in the street, silent. And I couldn't move. Helen ran before she even understood why. Her heart pounded so fast it felt like it might burst through her chest. The wind clawed at her face, pulling at the hood of her jacket, but she didn't stop. Not when the shadows twisted between the trees, not when the silence pressed down like a heavy weight. Her parents had moved them here, Millwood Crossing, a town that seemed too quiet, too still. At first, she thought it was just a small town thing. Friendly neighbors, old houses, sleepy streets. But the quiet was wrong. It had weight. It had purpose. By the second day, Helen noticed the patterns. The doors all locked themselves at the same time every night. The town bell rang like a warning, not a call. And the people, they watched too much but never spoke, never smiled. "Helen, don't wander off," her mother had said that first evening, her voice tight with something Helen didn't understand yet. But Helen had wandered anyway, drawn to the edge of town, where the trees thickened, where the shadows moved differently. It was there she first saw them. Hollow figures. Motionless. Faces that should have been human but weren't. Eyes empty, mouths slightly open as if they had whispered something just before she arrived. Her stomach had dropped. A shiver ran down her spine. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt heavy, trapped in her throat. And then she realized the silence was alive. It followed her back to the house. It pressed against the windows. It waited for the night to fall. By the third night, Helen's mother and father began to change. It was subtle at first. A word out of place. A smile that didn't reach the eyes. Margaret, her sister, started whispering things Helen couldn't quite hear, but they made her stomach twist with fear. And Uncle Robert? Helen could see it in him, the strain, the dread he tried to hide behind tired eyes. Then came the screams. It wasn't like the screams she'd heard in movies, sharp and distant. These were close, personal. Voices she recognized, her parents, her sister, begging for her, pleading, whispering. But the sound, it wasn't quite right. Hollow, distorted. Like the words had been chewed up and spat back out. In the town? The neighbors didn't react. They didn't call the police. They simply watched. By the fourth night, Helen understood the truth. Millwood Crossing wasn't normal. The people weren't just secretive, they were trapped. Every whispered story she'd overheard about the missing didn't make sense until now. Those missing weren't gone. Not really. Something had them. Something ancient. Something that learned from voices, from emotions, from fear. And it was patient. Helen's resolve hardened. At 11, she understood what her parents did not. They weren't going to save her. No one was coming to save her. Survival meant understanding the rules. Survival meant observing, learning, remembering every sound, every movement, every shadow. She learned quickly. The hollow figures moved at night. They didn't chase, not exactly. They tested. They knocked. They whispered. They knew which words would make her flinch, which tones could make her heart hammer faster. And they remembered. "Helen, let us in. It's cold out here. You love me, don't you?" The voice of her mother, every night, perfect. Her father, demanding, commanding. Margaret, crying, desperate. And each night, Helen felt her courage waver just a little more. But she learned. She watched patterns. She noticed the cycles. The town bell. The streets. The houses that seemed to wait, expectant. She learned when to move, when to hide, when to speak, and most importantly, when to be silent. 2 years passed. 2 years of counting chimes, of memorizing streets, of seeing Thomas's little body curl into himself every night while Uncle Robert slept in the living room, a human shield between them and the hollow shells. Helen grew older, sharper, faster. Fear became strategy. Strategy became knowledge. Knowledge became hope. And then, she found it. A journal. Tucked in the dusty shelves of the town library, written over a century ago. The things are not corporeal. They have no bodies. They require us to give them form, through sound, through breath, through life itself. Silence weakens them. Knowledge may save us. Helen read and reread, heart pounding. This was it. The rules. The way to survive. The way to escape. She didn't tell Uncle Robert. He would have tried to stop her. Thomas, he was too fragile. She would do this alone. The plan was simple but deadly. She needed someone to take her place. Someone to remain willingly, consciously, bound to the town, bound to the things. And one day, maybe finally she could leave. If anyone can get out of this town alive, it's me. I will learn the rules. I will watch. I will wait. And I will escape. Helen didn't know it yet, but her life had changed forever. The town's silence had become her teacher. The hollow shells, her constant reminder. And the shadows, her obsession. She was 11, alone, and ready. It knew my sister's voice. Every tone, every inflection, every pleading word. And I could do nothing. The thing outside the door was learning. It was patient, precise, meticulous. Helen pressed her back against the wall, fingers clutching the door frame, listening. Margaret's voice called again. Helen, help me, please. It was her sister, but not her sister. Not anymore. Something hollow wore her face. The voice, every nuance, was there. But it was a weapon. A trap. Every word designed to break her. Uncle Robert sat on the floor, fists clenched so tight the knuckles had gone white. His breathing was shallow. Every now and then, his head flicked toward the door as if expecting the thing to strike next. Helen wondered if he regretted helping them, if he understood now that this wasn't just survival, it was torture. Hours passed. The voices didn't stop. Mother, father, sister repeated endlessly. Anne's voice begged, Thomas's voice panicked, Margaret's voice pleaded, each cycle slightly sharper, slightly more precise. Helen counted them. 50 times for her mother, 30 for her father, 20 for Margaret. Each repetition chipped away at her resolve, like water hollowing stone. By dawn she was numb. Not grief, numbness was too clean a word. Hatred had begun to grow, a cold, hard thing forming in her chest. Hatred for the things outside, for the voices that weren't voices, for the parents who had unwittingly doomed them all. When Robert finally unlocked the door, Helen bolted outside. She needed to see. The street was empty. Hollow figures stood motionless in the daylight, the original 3 and now 3 more. Her parents and Margaret. Faces open-eyed but empty. Bodies breathing but soulless. Her mother's clothes were torn. Her feet bleeding. A thin line of drool hung from her slack mouth. But she stood, alive but a shell. Her father made a low animal sound, trying to move, but Robert caught him. That's not her, Robert said, voice rough. That's not them anymore. Thomas collapsed against Robert, crying. Where did they go? Where are they? Robert had no answer. Helen didn't know either. Perhaps their souls had scattered, trapped somewhere invisible. Or perhaps they simply no longer existed. Either possibility was terrifying. The neighbors watched from porches, hesitant. Shock, pity, understanding. This wasn't new. It had happened before. And it would happen again. Sheriff Hadley arrived mid-morning. A grizzled man, familiar with horrors but unsettled by this. You 3 the only ones left? He asked. Yes, Robert said. The town had its rules. Every family counted. Every absence disrupted the balance. Every voice stolen added weight to the curse. And now Helen understood. She was living inside a carefully maintained prison. Night fell again and the voices returned. Perfectly timed, perfectly practiced. Her mother, sweet and pleading. Father, commanding, enraged. Margaret, crying and desperate. Every emotional button pushed. And each night, Helen felt her resolve weaken just a little more. Robert began sleeping in the living room, between the children's bedroom and the door, a buffer against temptation, against weakness. Helen asked him one morning, a month after her parents disappeared, "How long can we do this?" "As long as we have to," he said. "What other choice is there?" Helen stared at him, eyes cold. She was learning the rules, memorizing the patterns, studying weaknesses. She was 11 years old, and something in her had hardened into steel. She wouldn't die here. She wouldn't give in. 2 years passed. Helen became a scholar of Millwood Crossing. She studied town records, newspapers, old diaries. She learned about the history, the curses, the families who had tried and failed. At least 30 families had attempted escape. All failed. Either returned as hollow shells or found torn apart in the woods. The valley itself was a trap. A bowl of land surrounded by mountains. Only 3 narrow passes. Compasses spun. Atmospheric anomalies made no sense. The things were bound to the land. And everyone else was bound to them. Thomas grew quiet. The trauma had shattered his childhood. He had nightmares nightly, whimpering through walls. Uncle Robert aged rapidly, guilt and grief etched deep lines across his face. He drank just enough to dull the edges of reality. The hollow bodies never left the streets. They became fixtures. At night they walked, knocked, whispered, used stolen voices to manipulate the living. Most of the town ignored them after years. But Helen never could. She found Ezekiel Morrison's journal in the library, old, leather-bound, frantic handwriting from 1891. The things which take us are not corporeal. They require form through our voices, our sounds, our very breath. Silence weakens them. Bound to the valley they cannot leave, nor can we. Each living soul is an anchor. If we leave without breaking the tether, they follow. Helen reread it. The curse wasn't about imprisonment. It was containment. And there was a loophole. Substitution. Voluntary replacement. Someone could take her place. Only then could she escape. She couldn't tell Uncle Robert. He would try to stop her. Thomas? Too fragile. This had to be done alone. It took months, but eventually someone came. Jake. Early 20s, hollow-eyed, drifting. He didn't have anywhere to go. Helen observed him, calculated, tested. And slowly, carefully, she befriended him. Explained the town, the rules, the horrors at night. Jake listened. Wary, weary, but willing. When she asked, "Could you take my place?" he nodded. "I'll do it. I have nowhere else." The plan was set. Final preparations. Maps, supplies, journal copies. The northern pass marked. The timing precise. 1 minute after the bell, the substitution would happen. Thomas begged her not to go. Uncle Robert looked terrified, exhausted. "You're braver than your father," Robert whispered, holding her. "If anyone can get out, it's you." The bell rang. Helen's hand gripped the door. Jake stepped in. She stepped out. The moment the crossing of thresholds occurred, she felt it, a pulling, threads of binding, unraveling, rewinding, transferring from her to Jake. "I feel it," he gasped. "God, I feel it." The locks clicked. Jake was trapped inside, bound to the town, bound to the things. And Helen, free. She ran, past the hollow bodies, past the streets, past the shadows that had haunted her for years. Nothing followed. Nothing stopped her. The valley, the curse, the town, she had escaped. By dawn, she reached the mountain pass. Millwood Crossing was a gray smudge below, swallowed by distance. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to cry, to process. Then she moved forward. 2 days later, she arrived at Riverside, small town, 3,000 people. Exhausted, filthy, starving. She ran straight to the police, tried to explain. They didn't believe her. Helen gave names, dates, maps, journal copies. The officers checked records. Missing persons, strange disappearances, connections to Millwood Crossing. And yet, no evidence of the town itself. The authorities would dismiss her, label her delusional, traumatized. But Helen knew the truth. She had escaped. She had survived. She had won. But the price lingered. Thomas and Robert were still trapped. Hollow bodies still walked at night. And the valley, it waited. Patient. Eternal. Helen had survived. But she would never forget. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the voices whispering through the walls of my mind. Always waiting. Always patient. Freedom felt impossible, yet real. The valley was behind me, but its shadow stretched forward. Helen's legs ached. Her lungs burned. Every step away from Millwood Crossing felt like victory and terror. The night air was cold, crisp, unrelenting. She checked over her shoulder. Nothing moved. No shadow followed. No voice whispered. The mountain pass stretched before her, jagged and unforgiving. She kept walking. The flashlight in her hand barely cut through the darkness. The valley below was swallowed in mist. The town was gone, or had it never been real? Her mind replayed the hollow bodies, her parents' blank eyes, Margaret's pleading voice, her father's rage. By dawn, she reached a ridge overlooking the forested lowlands. She paused. The valley was behind her, the world ahead. But the world beyond was unfamiliar, dangerous, untrusting. Helen didn't have maps, only notes from Ezekiel's journal and memories of old roads. She had to find help. The first town she reached was Riverside. Small, quiet. 3,000 people, orderly streets. She stumbled into the police station, panic in her eyes, desperation in her voice. "Please, you have to help me. There's a town, a curse." The officers listened politely, their faces calm, practiced. They gave her water, asked questions, suggested she stay calm. She explained Millwood Crossing, the binding, the hollow shells, the nightly voices. She gave names, dates, maps, journal copies. At first, disbelief, then confusion, then concern. Records existed of missing persons linked to Millwood Crossing, but no one had reported the town itself. All evidence had been concealed, erased, hidden. Helen realized that escaping had only given her one advantage: knowledge. Others were still trapped, unknowing. 3 weeks passed. Helen stayed in a foster home, watching news reports, reading records, waiting. Task forces assembled, investigated. But Millwood Crossing remained a ghost, a town without a record, without proof. Everyone within it had been manipulated, coerced, or replaced by hollow shells. The town itself had learned to survive by hiding, by denying, by manipulating anyone who might discover the truth. And Helen, she had escaped, but she carried the burden. Sleep was difficult. Every night she dreamed of the valley, of her mother's pleading voice, the hollow shells, Thomas and Uncle Robert. In her dreams she ran uphill, chased by shadows with familiar faces. She woke in cold sweats. One night she resolved, knowledge was not enough. She had to plan a rescue. The journal had given her answers. The binding could be transferred, but only voluntarily. Only if the substitute accepted it consciously. Helen began plotting. Maps, timing, routes, supplies. She memorized the mountain passes, the weak points, the hidden paths through forests. Every detail mattered. The things in the valley were patient. They waited. She had to move faster, smarter. Weeks of preparation turned into months. She stayed in contact with the authorities indirectly, offering tips, noticing patterns, learning about the valley's geography, magnetic anomalies, strange weather reports. The valley itself was alive, aware, and bound by rules she was still uncovering. Helen realized the town's history repeated itself. Families trapped, attempts to flee, failures, replacements. 30 documented escapes over a century. All ended in death or hollow shells. Every detail, every story confirmed what she had seen. The valley demanded balance. The tether required an anchor. Jake had survived, but at what cost? Helen had freed herself by substituting him. She thought of him often. Alone in the house, bound to the curse, enduring nightly visits from hollow parents and neighbors. His sacrifice weighed on her. But it had worked. Helen was free. Freedom was bittersweet. Every sound made her flinch. Every voice outside the foster home windows could have been a test, a trap. She couldn't fully relax. One evening she walked through Riverside's small downtown, observing people. Families laughing, cars driving past, dogs barking. Noise. Life. It should have felt comforting, but for Helen, it was foreign, dangerous even. Every sound carried a weight she couldn't explain. She knew one day she'd have to return. Not for vengeance. Not for closure. For Thomas. For Uncle Robert. For every family trapped inside that valley. But for now, survival. Gathering strength. Gathering knowledge. Then a faint call came from a local library she often visited. A researcher noticed anomalies, maps, old surveys, magnetic disturbances. Helen watched quietly from a corner. Perhaps someone else could help, but trust was dangerous. Too many might stumble into the valley unprepared, consumed like the others. Helen spent hours at night studying the journal again. Ezekiel Morrison had tried and failed. But he had been close. Substitution worked if willing. The anchor could transfer. But it had to be precise, careful. Every failed attempt ended in a hollow shell or death. Her resolve hardened. She would not fail. She would not run blindly. She would break the curse. One morning she spotted a young drifter, backpack slung, wandering streets like a ghost. Lonely, hollow-eyed. Ideal. She observed, calculated, waited. Timing, psychology, patience, everything had to align. Helen approached slowly, offering kindness, conversation, familiarity. She told him about the town, the rules, without embellishment. He listened, weary but intrigued. "Could you stay?" Helen asked one afternoon. "Take my place if it comes to it?" He looked at her, understanding the gravity without fully comprehending it. "I think I could," he said quietly. Helen felt the weight lift slightly. It was the first step. The plan was forming. Slowly, methodically, she would return. Not to flee, but to free her family, to undo the curse that had haunted Millwood Crossing for over a century. She spent the following weeks preparing, memorizing paths, creating contingencies, testing assumptions. She tracked the drifter's routines, his habits, his vulnerabilities. The substitution required acceptance, but Helen knew she could guide him carefully, safely toward the choice. Every night, she dreamed of the valley, but the dreams shifted. They were no longer purely terror, they were strategy. She learned the patterns. She anticipated the hollow shells' movements, the timing of nightly visits, the weaknesses in their routines. Helen's plan was ready. She had supplies, maps, knowledge, a willing substitute. She had to move quickly. Any delay could result in discovery. Any misstep could end in death. She knew this would take years, perhaps a lifetime. But the first step had been taken. She had survived the impossible. She had outsmarted a curse older than most towns in the region. And for the first time in her life, Helen Webb felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Hope isn't loud. It isn't visible. It whispers. And I had learned to listen. I thought escaping was the hardest part. I was wrong. Helen stared at the valley from the northern ridge. Millwood Crossing looked peaceful from this distance, almost normal. But she knew better. The hollow bodies, the nightly voices, the bindings, they were all still there waiting. Patient. Eternal. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faintest echo of a familiar voice. She froze. A hollow? Or memory? She couldn't tell. Every sense screamed danger, but she pressed on. Each step down the ridge was careful, deliberate, silent. No misstep could alert the things in the valley to her return. By nightfall, she reached the tree line bordering the valley. Shadows stretched unnaturally, following her as if they were alive. Helen crouched low, clutching the journal pages, the maps, and her flashlight. The northern pass was treacherous. Loose rocks, hidden roots, twisted branches, all could betray her to the valley. She paused, listening. Silence. Too perfect. Her heart raced. Then, faint movement. One of the hollow shells, standing at the edge of the street below, motionless, eyes empty, yet somehow aware. Helen swallowed hard. She had to move now. Her plan relied on precision, timing, observation, patience. Every hollow body had a routine. Every voice followed a pattern. The night she escaped, she had been invisible. This time she would remain unseen only for so long. She had to reach Jake's house, the current anchor point. The drifter had taken her place, but knowledge of the valley's weaknesses was hers alone. Helen slipped through the underbrush, keeping to shadows, avoiding open streets. Every sound, footsteps, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, made her flinch. She had been away for months, but the valley hadn't forgotten. It remembered every soul, every voice. Inside the town, streets were eerily empty. Lights flickered in a few houses. The hollow shells moved outside their usual positions. Their routines were not perfect, they never were, but their patience was frightening. They did not chase. They waited, observed, calculated. Helen reached the first street corner, peering down Maple Street. Jake's house was visible in the dim light. Windows shuttered, doors locked. He had been surviving here, bound to the curse, feeding it without question. She felt a pang of guilt, but there was no time for remorse. She had to gather supplies, understand how the substitution had worked, and prepare for the next step, freeing Thomas and Uncle Robert. Jake emerged on the porch, carrying a lantern. Helen ducked behind a tree, silent. His eyes flicked toward the darkness where she crouched. She held her breath. His lips moved, but no sound came. Hollow bodies sometimes mimicked voices, she reminded herself. Some shadows could speak, some could only echo. Jake. She didn't know. Minutes passed. He returned inside. Helen exhaled quietly. The anchor point was active. The valley was contained, but Jake's life was suspended in terror every night, every hour. The substitution had worked, but not perfectly. Not fully. Helen spent the next night observing from the roof of an abandoned barn. Using the journal and her own memory of patterns, she mapped the hollow shell's movements, the nightly patrols of voices, the timing of each approach to locked doors. Every hollow body had its rhythm, every voice its weakness. She memorized them all. Then she noticed something new. One shell, one house didn't follow the pattern. The voice, the mother's voice, lingered longer at the door than usual. Pleading, coaxing, emotional manipulation. It was testing the limits, testing Jake, testing the anchor. Helen's stomach dropped. If the anchor faltered, the curse could spiral. The valley would become unpredictable. She couldn't allow it. She had to act. The next morning, Helen entered the town cautiously. Streets were quiet. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees. She approached Jake's house through the backyard, avoiding main roads. Locked doors. Windows shuttered. Safe for now. She slipped inside, moving silently. Jake was in the kitchen, studying a map by lantern light. Hollow shells occasionally passed outside, tapping, whispering, testing. Helen's presence was undetected. She approached Jake quietly. "You need to help me," she whispered. He turned, startled. Recognition flashed in his eyes. Relief, confusion, fear. "I know how it works. The substitution, you did it for me. I know. But it's not enough. Others are trapped. We can fix it. I can help them with you." Jake nodded slowly. He understood. No words were needed beyond this. They had a plan. Helen's strategy required patience and cunning. She couldn't free the town in a single night. The bindings had to be managed carefully. One mistake, one unplanned substitution, and the hollow shells would overwhelm them both. She studied the house's rooms, escape routes, and the hollow body's patrol patterns. Night fell. Helen and Jake waited in the attic, listening. A mother's voice called. "Helen, let me in, it's cold." Jake flinched. Helen gripped his shoulder. "Ignore it. It's not her. It's just the binding. It's just them testing." They watched as shadows moved below, hollow figures circling, testing, probing. The voices mimicked the familiar, the loved, the lost. Pleas, commands, apologies, all designed to break resolve. Helen had trained herself to resist. Jake had to learn to. Hours passed. The hollow shells eventually returned to their positions. Helen and Jake moved silently, exiting the house to the street. The plan was precise. They would navigate through empty roads, reach Thomas and Uncle Robert's house, and prepare for a controlled substitution. The valley was alive with anticipation. Helen could feel it, sensing every movement, every silent pulse. The hollow shells had not noticed her yet, but they would, always. She moved quickly, confidently. The first stage of the rescue was underway. By midnight, they reached the edge of the house where Thomas and Uncle Robert were trapped. Windows boarded, doors locked. Inside, the nightly voices wailed, testing, pleading, commanding. Helen whispered instructions to Jake, showing him the windows to watch, the shadows to avoid. They waited for the right moment. One misstep, one sound, and the hollow bodies would react. Time slowed. The valley itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. Finally, the moment came. A brief lull in the nightly patrol. The voices had moved to another street. Helen and Jake slipped inside, moving quickly through dark hallways. Uncle Robert was asleep on the couch, exhausted, tense, guarding the doorway. Thomas was huddled in his bed, wide-eyed, listening to the voices. Helen whispered, "It's me. I'm here. We're going to fix this." They were close. Too close. Every heartbeat echoed in the silent house. Outside, the hollow shells stirred. Helen's mind raced. She calculated every step, every sound, every potential failure. The first act of the rescue was about to begin. The night was quiet, too quiet. Helen crouched in the shadows, watching the house on Maple Street. Jake moved silently inside, already bound to the binding, already one of them. Helen's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what had to happen. She had only one chance to save Thomas and Uncle Robert. One chance to finally break the curse. She crept to the window, peering through the glass. The hollow bodies stood outside, their vacant eyes catching the dim moonlight. Her parents, Margaret, the original drifters. Motionless, waiting, patient. They would know the moment she crossed the threshold. But she couldn't let that stop her. Not now. Taking a deep breath, Helen slipped inside the house. The air smelled cold and sterile, like the space between life and death. Every creak of the floor sounded like a scream. She moved toward Thomas's room, finding him awake, eyes wide, clutching a worn blanket. "Helen," he whispered. His voice trembled, almost swallowed by the silence. "It's me," she said softly. "We're leaving. I promise. You have to trust me." Uncle Robert appeared at the doorway, his face pale, exhausted, but determined. "Are you sure?" he asked. Helen nodded. "This is the only way. We either escape tonight, or remain prisoners forever." They moved together, silent, careful, toward the door. Outside, the hollow shells stirred. Voices called, soft at first, then rising. "Helen, let us in." "Thomas, obey." The words were perfect, painful. Her mother's voice, her father's, Margaret's, echoing from every corner. Helen ignored them, focusing on the plan. The substitution had worked for Jake. Now it had to work for Thomas and Robert. She handed Thomas the small charm she'd found in Ezekiel Morrison's journal. An anchor for the tether, a vessel for the binding to transfer. "Hold this," she instructed. "It will take you with me." The first step was the hardest. Helen opened the front door, and the hollow bodies moved, gliding like shadows. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of 100 trapped souls. Her mother's voice shrieked now, not a plea but a demand. "Don't leave me." Thomas gripped the charm. Uncle Robert stood close, breathing deep, ready to leap if the hollow shells attacked. Helen counted, 3, 2, 1. They ran. The moment they crossed the threshold, a force like invisible chains tried to drag them back. But the charm pulsed in Thomas's hands, a warm, glowing tether, absorbing the binding. Jake's sacrifice had been enough to break part of it. This final act severed the rest. The hollow bodies screamed, not with voices but with soundless agony. Faces twisted, mouths opening in impossible shapes, eyes flashing as if realizing their control slipping. Helen felt the pull ease, then vanish entirely. For the first time in 12 years she felt truly free. They ran down the streets, past the empty houses, past the fields that had imprisoned generations. The valley stretched before them, dark and wide, but Helen knew the passes. She led them up the northern ridge, the same path she had taken months ago. Behind them, the valley seemed to rage, shadows clawing at the edges, but they could not reach inside. Dawn broke as they crossed the mountain pass. Helen turned back once, tears streaking her dirt-covered face. Millwood Crossing was a smudge of gray, swallowed by distance. No hollow bodies followed. No voices called. Silence. They descended into the world beyond, exhausted, bleeding but alive. The air smelled sweet, free, real. For the first time, Helen breathed without the weight of the curse pressing on her chest. Thomas looked at her, eyes wide, hope and disbelief battling in his gaze. Uncle Robert clapped a hand on her shoulder, voice cracking. "You did it, Helen. You saved us all." Helen shook her head. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other. And someone has to remember." In the weeks that followed, authorities never found Millwood Crossing. Maps showed a valley, a town, a place that existed only on paper. But Helen knew the truth. She had broken the binding, freed those trapped, and survived. And she carried with her a warning. Some places are meant to stay hidden, some darkness is better left contained, but courage, knowledge, and sacrifice, they can create miracles even in the worst of horrors. Helen never returned to Millwood Crossing. But she remembered, always. And every night, when she closed her eyes, she hoped the valley, the hollow shells, the cursed town, they were finally at rest.